Before we begin the actual talk about the importance of socialization and relationships, are you okay over there? I'd like for you all to, this is a pretty well publicized study. I'm sure that many of you have heard about it from your doctors or from friends. This is a study that showed that the more leisure activities we do, the more active we are, the better off our cognition is over time. So before I get started talking a little bit more about the importance of social relationships, I'd like for all of you to kind of pause for a moment and think about what is it that you've done in the past, let's say the past day, that has helped, that's been a leisure activity that's helped you improve your brain health. Can we think of one or two things? Has anyone done anything that's active? What have you done?
I drove here.
Yeah, you drove here. That's great. That's perfect. Yeah. Anyone do anything else? Any leisure activities to promote brain health?
Played cards.
Played cards. That's great. Anyone else?
I took a bus here.
But getting on a bus, seeing the people on the bus, that's great. So we're going to come back to this at the very end. But I want you to think about the things that you generally, playing cards, driving around. I want you to think about those as we talk about the importance of social relationships. So again, my name is Dr. Denise LaBelle, and I'm a fellow here. We're going to talk a little bit more about how your brain is a social brain. So the very earliest studies, the very earliest information we have about how important it is to, can you hear me? Okay. So the very first information that we've had about how important socializing and relationships are actually comes to us from these historical accounts of children who grew up in the wild, children who grew up without society, without families. And what they found is that when they brought the children out of the woods, these isolated kids, they had a hard time learning language. They had permanent cognitive and physical disabilities sometimes. What we know now is that you need social relationships, not just to have, to learn language or to learn etiquette, but you also need social relationships because they help your developing brain actually grow. So the insulation, there's this recent lab study that showed that the insulation around your nerves, starting at about 3 weeks of age, needs social contact, needs social relationships in order for that insulation on your nerves to form properly. And that if you're deprived that you end up getting, it's essentially like your nerves don't have the appropriate insulation, they can't work as well. So what we've learned now about humans is that we are social animals, essentially, just like in many ways similar to other primates, to dogs, to rodents. This guy right here, this guy where my mouse is, that is a prairie vole. What is a prairie vole? A prairie vole is actually very important for this sort of research because what we learned from the prairie voles have another cousin, the mountain vole. And the prairie voles, they mate for life. They get married, they have one partner, and they stay monogamous. Whereas the the mountain voles are a little bit, they got lots of partners. And what they found out is that these prairie voles, the only thing that's different between them is that they have this different chemical. This chemical that's pictured over here, and that's called oxytocin. And it's very important for pair bonding. It's actually when you give someone a hug, when a mother nurses her child, that's the chemical that's released. It's a chemical that's responsible for trust and responsible in large part in our brains for affiliative relationships, for kind of that social, that feeling of affection and trust that you get when you're in a good social relationship. So before we talk a little bit more about the benefits and why having relationships is good, I'd like to talk a little bit about why loneliness is bad. Because that's actually, there's way more research on that, and that's actually a little bit easier to understand initially. So it's important for us to understand first that there's a difference between being isolated and being lonely. So, and the best way to explain this is maybe to talk about the difference between people who are introverts and who really prefer to spend most of their time alone. They're not bothered if it's just them and one other person or if they don't see anyone all day. That's very different from being lonely. You can, and I'm sure we've all had the experience of feeling lonely even when we're surrounded by people, even when we're surrounded by people that we maybe care about. So the feeling of loneliness is really this sense of feeling disconnected, of feeling like the quality or the number of relationships that you have, they're not really, you wish you had more. You yearn for more. That's really the sense of loneliness. So we're going to talk a little bit about loneliness and what it does. So loneliness and, in conjunction, connectedness to other people really changes not just your kind of environment, but it also changes your body and your brain. And this is kind of a complex slide, but I'm going to break it down a little bit. So this first, these pieces of your brain up here, this prefrontal cortex, that's a part of your brain that's responsible for reasoning. The striatum here, that's part of your brain that's responsible for rewards. So when you have, I like to, you can talk about it as like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The striatum is responsible for feeling good when there's sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And it's also responsible for feeling pleasure when you have a good social connection with someone, or when someone smiles at you. That's a part of your brain that lights up. When we look at the changes that happen, we know that there are changes in our metabolism, in our stress response hormones, in our blood pressure from being lonely. And we know that that happens not just in humans, but also in animals. So the animal studies have done a whole bunch of work looking at this. So these are little marmosets. And what they found is that with marmosets, which are social animals, they hang out in these little groups in the trees. When they're isolated from each other, or when you mix up the groups, there's a greater stress response. So the monkeys get really stressed out. And we see something similar in humans. Loneliness, that feeling of loneliness, of not having enough connection, is associated with higher blood pressure, with poorer immunity, more likely to get sick. And it's also associated with having more fractured sleep. So you wake up more when you're feeling lonely throughout your day. The crab-eating macaque, which is another animal model that they've studied to look at socialization. What they found is that if you take a macaque and you say, hey, we're gonna make sure that you're alone for a little while, so you isolate them first, and then you put them like suddenly into new groups, their hormone levels go all over the place, and they actually start to lose weight. And when humans, we know that if you take a human and they're very lonely, they actually can develop metabolic syndrome, which is like if you have diabetes, that's like, it's really bad. Your insulin gets messed up, your ability to metabolize things gets messed up. We also know that lonely people, the part of your brain that's like, hey, hooray, someone's smiling at me, that doesn't fire as intensely as it does for people who aren't lonely. So if you're well socially connected, you have less stress, a healthier body and like digestive system, and you're getting more reward out of your everyday interactions. So that's all, that's what we know about bodies and brains, but what about thinking abilities? What about, longevity? Well, what we know is that, and there have been a lot of studies on this, is that you have increased mortality. Now what that means is that when they look at all the variables that are associated with our earlier age of sickness or death, that loneliness was actually, in a couple studies, more powerful of a predictor of lifespan than obesity or air pollution. There have been other studies that show that this, loneliness is it's associated with higher mortality, and that's true even if you take into account things like, do you jog every day? Are you eating healthy? Are you seeing your doctor regularly? That the importance of social connectedness is important so far beyond what we take it for granted a little bit. And we also know that the lonelier that people are, that their cognition, their thinking abilities are not as sharp, and that over time they decline farther and faster. And I got some ideas about why that is that are still, that we'll talk about in a moment. But that is loneliness. And before we go on to connectedness, the sort of the positive other side of this, I want you to think about, if we take the past 10 years, the past 50 years of your life, if you had to think about a sad time you had, like a day, if you had to pinpoint the worst day of your life, if you think about that for a moment, just hold it in your head for a moment. For how many of you does that worst day involve the loss of another person? Anyone? Yeah, a couple. Most people. It involves, if it's not the loss of a person, it's the loss of a relationship. Or if it's not the loss of a person or a relationship, it almost inevitably involves someone else. It involves a connection. And I say this to illustrate the fact that our connectedness, even though it's always around us, we really do take it for granted because it is the medium by which we have some of our best and some of our worst experiences. If I asked you to stop and think about the happiest day of your life, say past 5 years, past 10 years, how many of those experiences involve someone else? Yeah, does anyone want to share a happy experience, the best day of their life? Any ideas?
Well, today is the day that I lost my daughter 3 years ago. She was brain injury. But one of the happiest days is all her art was exhibited.
That's beautiful.
2000 for Special Olympics.
That's beautiful. That's wonderful.
BMGM Hotel.
That's so cool.
That was one great day. And I try to concentrate on those better days.
And you know what's interesting about that is that is a perfect example of how one of the best days of your life can be not just involving someone else, but involving kind of addressing or mitigating the loss of someone else, you know? Yeah. Did you have a happy moment that you wanted to share?
The day I was married and the day children were born.
Yeah. You get that a lot. A lot of people, because it's the day that you get to, that's doubly social, because you get to not only solidify a bond that you have with a person, but you get to, like the day for a wedding, for example, show all of your other connections, all of your other relationships, that this is my penultimate, this is my most important relationship. So it's social interaction is so much of the backdrop of what we do in our day-to-day life, but it is, and we take it for granted sometimes because of that, but it is really, truly so central to what we are about as humans. So there's lots of theories about how and why social connectedness is important. And one of the reasons that I emphasize how kind of taken for granted it has been is because when people initially looked at the health benefits, the mortality benefits of social connectedness, they just assumed that this was kind of like people were, the reason that you're healthier when you're in a social network, they assumed it was because your friends were telling you to exercise and that, health behaviors like quitting smoking and watching your weight, that these behaviors were kind of fostered by the group that you were around. But what we found is that that's not the case, that the benefits of social interaction and the benefits of having good, strong, solid relationships outweigh. I mean, having a group of people who are exercising regularly around you does help. It definitely is a part of it, but it's not the big part of it. It's not the most important part of it. There have been people who, there's a very old theory that's like 120 years old that the more social connection you have, when you look at like primates, like little monkeys and big monkeys and apes and us, that the size of the brain is associated with the complexity of the social environment. And so that doesn't really explain how it works, but that's true, and we know that that's true now. And there are other people who think that maybe this was working through oxytocin, maybe this chemical oxytocin that's mediating that physiological, that body response to trust and to connection, maybe that's playing a role. And this is all still being explored. But what we do know is that chemical oxytocin, which is there for trust, and it's there when women nurse, it's there when women give birth. It's also there when you orgasm, for what that's worth. That actually reduces the fear part of your brain, the amygdala, which is on sometimes. It can actually be reduced there. We know that children with autism who have difficult time interacting socially, if you give them oxytocin, like a nasal spray, they actually, while that's active, have an easier time relating to people, and cognition or social relatedness improves a little bit. So it's a big area of research now. But beyond that, one of the other reasons why it's been so hard to study exactly why and how social relationships improve your life is because if I asked you, if you said to me, where in your brain am I processing social interactions, I would have to say, well, your whole brain. And this is the best approximate map that I have been able to find of where different parts of social relationships, social interaction, human connectedness land. So number one, that theory of mind, just to go through a few. Theory of mind is the thing that they know is missing in like kids with autism. It's right kind of in this back region of your brain, and it's one of the things that helps you understand when, if I'm having a conversation with someone and they turn around, I understand that they've disengaged from me socially, and that's a nonverbal behavior, and that back part of your brain helps understand that. If we look at number 13, the mirror neuron system, that's another part of your brain that's also in the back. It's on the back on both sides. And what we know from that is that that responds in part to like social mimicry. So I don't know if you've ever, I do this with my sister a lot, where if she's sitting next to me and she takes a sip of her water, I'll take a sip of my water. Or if she crosses her legs, I'll cross my legs. And we're always sensing those things. And so when there's someone who's in our immediate environment, your mirror neurons are partially activated by their action. And it helps facilitate what's called social mimicry, and that sort of kind of nonverbal relatedness. And even if we go down to it's actually 18, we talked about loneliness, social rejection, which is processed more in the middle, kind of front under part of your brain. Social rejection, there's some evidence, there's a really cool study done, some evidence that we actually feel social rejection the same way and in the same pathways that we feel pain, like physical pain, which anyone who's ever had, and everyone has had, instance of social rejectedness, that feeling of loss, of being shoved out is physically painful. It's definitely emotionally painful, but now we know that emotion pain is as serious, as real as a physical pain. And even going down to 20 and 21, these moral decision making and fairness and trust processing, reasoning about that. Should I trust this person? They stole all my money, but should I trust them in the future? That part of our brain, that's the frontal lobe of our brain, and that's the front part taking in all of this other information about nonverbal stuff and about past experiences and about how they make me feel. That front part of your brain is making decisions about whether or not, kind of executive decisions about whether or not to trust other people, whether or not to continue pursuing a relationship, whether or not to, if someone's doing something wrong, to say something about it or to be complicit or to, all these higher level things. So if anyone ever asks you, where in my brain is social connectivity, is socialization, what part of my brain does that? Your answer should be, it's your whole brain, because it really is. If we think about what connectedness changes, connectedness, it changes inflammation. It can directly impact any sort of inflammatory process, be it physical illness, be it like a cold. If you're socially isolated, you are not going to, your immune system isn't going to be as good as it would be otherwise, whereas connectedness itself actually improves things. Some of this early work comes from the Framingham Heart Study, which I don't know if you've heard about it, but it was like a big study that's been going on since like the 60s. And it's one of the first studies that looked at, do men or women have more heart attacks? It's the first study that found, it's the first really big study that found that smoking cigarettes impacts heart health. And it's still going on. And one of the things that they found is that, and they were just looking at heart stuff, but they've been doing these big studies collecting all this data about people. And what they found is that social networks actually improve kind of inflammatory markers in your heart. So you had better heart health when you were really socially connected. We also know that it improves cognition. And this is, I think, just some of the coolest, best research. So what they found is that if you social network size, meaning how connected you were to other people, this changed the association between, it changed the association between like age and cognitive decline. So what they found is that if you are really socially connected, because we all experience a little cognitive decline as we age, but that decline for healthy people and for people who had dementia or some sort of illness, that both of those populations actually declined less quickly than those who had fewer social connections. So more socialization, more social connection equals better brain health is the takeaway there. And what's also fascinating about that is that, about this study in particular, is that it was also associated with how sick your brain got. So we know that like Alzheimer's disease and multiple sclerosis and frontotemporal dementia, that all these different types of sicknesses, that they all have kind of their own signature in the brain. And what they found is that if you looked at these people's brains, they donated them, the people who were more socially connected had less pathology in their brain, had less of the sort of the brain signature of it. And that this was true even for people, the impact on cognition, improving cognition, having better cognition, was also true even for people who had really severe forms, really advanced disease. So this isn't just, people are staving off, further sickness. What it's saying is that no matter where you are in your life, no matter where you are in your cognition, in your aging process, in your disease, having more social relationships keeps your brain healthier, and it keeps your cognition healthier. Which I think is pretty cool, right? Because people are everywhere. We can find them anywhere. So the other thing that the Framingham study found more recently, this is about, I guess, 8 years ago now, was that happiness. They did this cool network modeling where they looked at how different groups of people interacted with each other. And what they found was that happiness spread from person to person, and it spread from group to group. And they controlled for all the kind of typical things that you would think about. But what they showed is essentially that an increase in positivity in one person or in one group kind of made its way out. The sort of pay it forward mentality of taking care of your neighbor, of even just being around someone else who's enjoying themselves, enjoying their life, having a good time, that it's infectious, and that you can, people who are better connected who have better relationships, who have a lot of relationships, who prevent themselves from kind of withdrawing, as we all tend to want to do sometimes, that they we're better able to be happy. We're better able to feel the happiness promoting influence of their social circles. So, what does all of that mean? What do you think, knowing this, what do you think that you should do?
Smile more.
Yeah. There really is in this today's society, we all kind of stay on our phones, and sometimes we use our phones to stay connected, and it's all just very important. But it really is there being with someone, making sure that you talk to that friend, talk to that family member, that you reach out to them. It's one of the more overlooked and most important things. And so this is true not just for our own lives and for our own selves. This is not just true for making sure that we ourselves are calling that family member, but it's also true for, I'm sure that we can all think of someone in our lives who is a little bit more alone than maybe they should be, maybe they have been in the past. I would encourage you all to reach out to that person, to whoever, because it's one of the best things you can do for your brain. So the next time that someone asks you, what have you done for your brain today? Driving is excellent, but also just talking to someone else on the phone, keeping up with someone you care about, that's also important. Let's say that. So that's actually, I went a little bit much faster than I anticipated. Who has questions? Who wants me to repeat a thing or to talk more about a thing? Yes?
Well, I find it very exclusive from other people. People are on their cell phones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you walk in the room and they acknowledge you. If two of them are doing it, they're doing two separate things, and you sit there and you look at them.
Yeah.
And it never occurs to them to acknowledge somebody else.
Yeah, I think that it's part of that is because we've made a really big trend.
Repeat her question or comment?
What's that?
Can you repeat her question or comment?
Yes,
just so the little sites can-
So she made a comment about
Self.
about how cell phones, about how it feels very kind of isolating and disengaging. Is that fair to say? When you walk into a room and no one's making eye contact, everyone's on their phone. I think that one of the reasons that occurs so frequently is really that we've transitioned so quickly from being a society that's so analog, where if you want to talk to someone, if you want to see someone's face, you have to go see it, you have to go find them in the world. And whereas now you can press a button and see their face.
Well, I can go on a 15-minute break in person. The whole time I'm in there, that's all there are.
Yeah.
And when they walk away, they say, excuse me, or something.
Yeah.
It's really kind of disconcerting.
It is. And I think that as we figure out, so she again mentioned the 15-minute break with no social interaction because of the phone, that I think as we figure out kind of the rules of how to not let these devices really take over our lives, I think as a society we're still kind of figuring out how to do that.
Is there a social network here at Cleveland Clinic that we can attend or belong to?
This is it
Well,
right
you're doing
here.
it.
Right here.
Right here.
So I don't, I'm actually not the best person to answer that because I only started here a couple months ago.
Facebook page? I don't think we do. We have social programs such as Lunch and Learn, art therapy for patients and caregivers, art and afternoons for patient and caregivers, Cleveland Museum of Art for people that just want to actually, it's a video conference from actual Cleveland Museum of Art held in our conference room, so people can attend and actually talk about artwork at the Cleveland Museum of Art. But we don't have like maybe like a Facebook page, if that's what you're asking for patients and caregivers to socially. But we have programs encouraging people to come out and participate and socialize with each other.
So to answer your question, there is no established pro-social, exclusive pro-social program, but there are social things you can do, such as this. And perhaps that will be in the future.
Because a lot of people go to classes and then they just walk away.
Yeah.
And they don't talk to you.
Well, and it's really one of the other reasons why it is often so difficult or it's easy to stay isolated. It's one of the reasons why so much of the research has been on loneliness is because it's hard. It's hard to get like a social group going. There's just so many variables in play. And so what I would encourage you to do is and we all can do this, we all have agency to foster this, to support this, is to ask if a couple people want to stay afterwards for coffee, or offer to host or to help host, or see if there's any other interest in that sort of social connectedness, and taking the opportunities that you have that are from us or from wherever else, and making them deeper, more connected experiences.
Another good trick is if you want to volunteer somewhere, that's a great way to meet people.
Yeah, volunteering is a great
Art
way.
museum or anything. Sometimes that's a good way.
Yeah, and that's another important point is a lot of people, and I probably should have included something like that on this slide, but there are volunteering is a great way to increase your social connectedness, if only because you're meeting a bunch of new people, and some of those people you might really hit it off with. So volunteering is a good way. You could do it, at centers like this. Community centers are great. If you're feeling like you want to keep up with someone much younger, boys and girls clubs can be really great and really rewarding. There's a variety of opportunities, and I'm sorry, I probably should have looked into that a little bit more. But it's just to reemphasize, when we talk about cognitive brain health, we talk about doing puzzles and we talk about doing all these things, right? And one of the things that we really don't talk about is the fact that interacting with another person is sometimes one of the biggest puzzles. They're giving you, it's like a 4-dimensional. They're giving you language and visuals, and they're trying to do a thing, and you don't. And so we spend a lot of our day kind of doing our own thing, and maybe ignoring the people around us. But if you ever take the time to think about the person you're interacting with, what they just did, try to imagine what they just did, what they're going to do. Are they going to go talk? Are they going to go take a nap? Are they going to go have a delicious lunch? What are they going to do next? Even that sort of like imaginal interaction, really it activates a lot of your brain. It's a human puzzle. We're all our own little puzzles. Mm-hmm.
So a couple things that have popped into my brain as I'm listening to this. One about volunteers. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes if you volunteer in a place that you are interested in, then you at least have that common ground with the person. So if it's, if it's LouRuvo Center for Brain Health, then you maybe have other people that have a passion for that, and so that's a great way to start relationships. But then the other thing I was going to ask you about is how much, so we have this social media that's going on out there, and people think they're connected, but at the same time, do they really feel connected, and how much is touch part of socialization?
Yeah.
Real touch.
Well, if we go back to our this slide, I'm gonna talk about this slide again in a second. However, that is an excellent question. So her first point, just for our remote sites, was to point out that if you volunteer at an institution, at a place that holds personal relevance to you, like say you love reading, if you volunteer at the library, the other volunteers at the library are probably really going to love books and reading. So the likelihood that you are going to make or form a new kind of solid relationship is higher at places like that. So volunteering at a place where you care about the subject matter is a great way to make and to foster established relationships. To address your question the question was about whether or not things like electronic social media really, does that hurt or help brain health? Does that, can we call that real, true social connectedness? And is there something about touch, about being in physical contact with someone that really is critical and changes things? So, is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
So, I'm going to talk about touch second, but to talk about the electronic stuff first. My general rule of thumb when I talk to my patients, or when I was doing psychotherapy on a regular basis to talk to my clients, to tell them about electronic media, social media, and social connection through that, is that it's great provided it does not replace other more personal and salient forms of communication.
Yes.
So my mom is a great example, and I use her all the time. Which she knows, which she's okay with. But you know, she's an older adult, and she is about to retire, and she is just a spectacular introvert. Like for her whole life, and she married a politician, which was just, like, what was she thinking? And she really now, you know, we encourage her, my sister and I, hey Mom, you know, let's get out, maybe go have coffee with, and she just really doesn't want to do it. She's content to sit at home by herself, and because it's a lot of effort for her, and it's very draining. It's that classic introvert experience of social interaction. So for her, when she's on Facebook, it is allowing her to connect more with people who she would usually be kind of trying too tiresome to connect with, and it's because it's more limited, more circumscribed, it's easier for her, and so it allows her to have relationships that she wouldn't, and keep up with relationships that she wouldn't otherwise be able to keep up with, and it's not taking the place, and it's not interfering with, you know, people she sees at work, or calling her mom every day, or talking to my sister or I, and you know, so the people who she's going to call, she still calls. The people who she's going to see, she still sees. But then she has this other world of social experience that is mediated by Facebook, essentially. That is very different from someone who wants to contact a person, but is maybe scared to do it, and so doesn't, and just looks at their Facebook page all day. That's very different from saying, well, I could go out to that party, or I could go out to that event, or I could go out to that museum, and instead staying home and just being on social media. So I encourage you all, and a good way to, and the people in your lives, to promote going out, promote whatever degree of contact. The closest, best degree of contact is sitting right next to a person, one-on-one. That's the most intimate sort of standard relationship we have. To have those, to encourage that, but if you can't do that, maybe call them. If you can't do that, follow them online.
The good thing is the OLLI program at UNLV, with all those classes for the Lifetime Learning Institute.
Oh, cool.
It's 5 days a week. They have satellite classes all around
That's great.
the area.
So
And it keeps me off the streets.
UNLV. I like that. It's UNLV. What was the name of the program?
Ollie.
Ollie.
At
Okay.
UNLV,
And so they have, for remote people, they have classes all over the place?
in everything.
Oh, cool.
And the teachers are the members, and these people are smart and retired people,
Yeah.
you know.
That's great.
And, that's my life.
I'm a member also.
Are you?
Oh, that's wonderful.
You do.
So,
So it's part of the extension for UNLV, and it's Osher Lifetime Living Institute. It's a
Okay.
nationwide organization. And
all
the
cool.
instructors are members themselves, usually retired people, but it could be their vocation, it could be their hobby, it could be an interest they have,
That's
or they
wonderful.
just want to facilitate a conversation. So,
I'm going to write it down because
OLLI.
Most colleges have it.
OLLIE.
No, OLLI.
OLLI for mobility. Great. So, and courses are another, just like, specific volunteer opportunities, courses are another way to do that. That's really beneficial. And just to actually quickly address the other part of the question about is touch the most important thing? And there's such cool research about this, guys. It's what they've found is that if you're, let's say you're really sick, you're in the ICU, or better yet, neonates. Kids, little babies who are born super prematurely. They struggle, and they're in these incubators. What they found out maybe like a decade ago is that if they have more contact with their mom, even though there's these little preemies and super sick, more contact, skin-to-skin contact with their mothers, they get better, they develop faster, they have better outcomes. And that sort of research, like using actual human touch, like skin-to-skin human touch, when you're in the ICU, when you have an illness, it makes a big difference. And one of the reasons why, when you give someone a hug and you feel that like, what a nice hug this is, and it's like a positive experience, that's oxytocin. That feeling of trust and affiliation, that's oxytocin in your brain. So what I would say about the importance of touch is if we look at this slide and it's got all these different areas, for one of the reasons why social connectivity is so good is because it's working on all of these places simultaneously. When you isolate, when you pull out an aspect of it, so you no longer have touch, and that means the part of your brain that's sensing touch and doing kind of reciprocity, that part isn't as active. When you're not hearing them, when you're not hearing the sound and the timbre of their voice, when you're not hearing the pace and the affection, all these things in someone's voice, that's another part of the social interaction that you're not experiencing. And that so social interaction is still a great complex puzzle, but now it's a great complex puzzle that has less of the different components to it. So it's still making your brain better, but it's making your brain, it's just exciting fewer parts of your brain differently. Does that make sense? Okay. So touch is important, but not the ultimate. So.
And so I wondered about it because I was thinking that was what's lacking from social media, is you can't have touch.
Yeah.
When you're doing it all online.
Well, there's so much more that's missing. Like when I sit across from my sister, even though we're not conscious of it, when I mimic her crossing her legs, or when she takes a sip of water the same time I do, that is bonding. That's building our relationship. And what's interesting is that people who, when there's a mismatch between that nonverbal thing, so if I'm doing a thing and then someone else is not responding, there's research that shows that your amygdala, your fear part, kind of perks up just a little bit. So one of the safety signals that we send unconsciously, no one's thinking about this, is having social mimicry, is having, I cross my leg when you cross your leg. It's saying that I'm engaged with you as a human, and I'm doing what you're doing. We're on the same page. You can trust me is the essential thing that the nonverbal stuff is sending. So it's more than just touch that you miss when you're interacting only online. It's a lot of things that you miss. So online is good, but only so long as it doesn't prevent the real stuff. So, any questions from remote, do you think?
When someone say they were quite lonely to themselves and they break out of their shell, so to speak, it must be very traumatic to go into a group. But how long does it take before start socializing?
Yeah.
Or What's that
When does it
made of?
kick in?
What's that look like?
So if you spend a lot of time, so the question is, if you spend a lot of time kind of socially isolated, when you start to socially connect, how long before you get used to it? Is that a fair recapitulation of what you wanted to ask? So really, it will depend on the individual. Like I used to do psychotherapy for individuals with social anxiety, with like significant, I never got married, I have no friends, I hadn't really had a one-on-one interaction outside of work in 50 years. I used to do therapy with individuals who had severe social anxiety disorder, and it varies. So for some people, you help them do it a little bit, and then they're great. It's kind of like you unlock them. You're like, congratulations, here's this ability now. For other people, it is a long slog, and every step of, okay, now I called the person. Okay, now I talked to the person and I had a conversation that lasted longer than a minute. Okay, right, now I can see the person in person. Okay, and every step of that can be painful. But basically, as soon as you feel not scared, and as soon as you feel like you can trust, even if it's just a little bit of trust, that's like a good sign. I don't know if there's, I'm sure there has been research, but I'm not aware of it, of how long and how connected you have to be in order for you to see the real benefits that these studies are talking about.
So introversion is not acceptable?
No, introversion is great. It's because it's not isolation, it's loneliness, which also means that you can be an extrovert and have all these friends, but if you feel lonely, a lot of the work has shown that you might be less at risk because you're getting all this activation, but that feeling of loneliness is very distressing and it takes its toll.
Can you speak a little louder?
Oh yes, of course.
Could you possibly speak a little louder?
Of course, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I think you could be lonely, but not a lonely person.
Yes, that is true, and this is not to pathologize feeling lonely. We all feel lonely sometimes. Sometimes we feel lonely a lot, but feeling lonely chronically, feeling lonely all the time, and in a way that you can't help, in a way that you can't kind of address, in a way that you feel like, I wish it wasn't this way, but I don't know what to do. Mm-hmm. That's really that severe loneliness that leads to a lot of these negative outcomes, which is why, just to reiterate, that it's not just us fixing our own connections. It's reach out to those people in your life. Reach out to those people who you think might want to talk to someone, might want to have a cup of coffee, might want to just, even if you send them a quick note, hey, I was thinking of you. That makes a difference. It makes a difference to that person. We aggressively underestimate how much we matter in terms of the difference we can make in other people's lives. And nowhere is that more true than in the feeling of social connectedness and the feeling of feeling loved and cared about.
So I have an older friend, and she's almost 80, and she's getting to the point where now she says to me, I don't want to go out and be social. Mm-hmm. I'm happy here. Mm-hmm. Is that a warning sign that she no longer wants to get out and about, or is that totally acceptable? So you got to dig a little bit deeper, because some people, so the answer is yes, and the question is if you're an older adult who's, doesn't feel like going out anymore, is that okay? And the answer is yes or no, depending. Like all things in psychology, it depends. So sometimes withdrawal can be a warning sign that sometimes people don't want to go out and socialize because they're embarrassed, because they're having a hard time with their memory or with their language or with their attention. They can't keep up, and they're worried about what other people will think. They have a little bit of shame, and shame is the big disconnect. Shame is the emotion that makes us sever our relationships. If, however, the person is
you know, happy just to have the talk with you, or happy to, doesn't want to go out to parties anymore just because it's, you know, it's a lot of work. And they find the relationships that they have one-on-one, rewarding. That's okay. That's all right. So anytime you have a friend, a parent, a sibling, a child, anyone in your life who is withdrawing socially, ask them what's going on. If they tell you, I'm not worried, it's no big deal, then that's okay. If they tell you that it's because they're sad, or because they're worried, or because they're embarrassed, do your best to help mitigate those fears and help bring them out.
And sometimes you can even arrange, like there's lunches, senior lunches and stuff, and you can even get a bus to come pick them up and take them there. And that, you make it available to them, they might do that occasionally.
Yeah.
Just to get out, and that's a good way to meet people.
That's, you know, another reason to ask more about why it is that they want to not go out. Because if it's something as simple as I can't drive anymore, the bus takes too long, and so forget it. Just forget it. It's too much work. I don't want to bother. I don't want to be a bother. I hear that all the time.
Quarter a day ahead.
Yeah. And so if you can arrange transport, if you can remove the barrier between the individual, yourself, or your family, or your friends, if you can remove that barrier, they're going to be better off. They're going to be...
Or even has something where even if they went out in the backyard, or if they could sit outside somewhere in a park, a safe place, they might meet people randomly.
Yeah.
And like in the old days, you had little villages.
Right.
And you had a coffee house, you had little,
Yeah.
and now it's like massive subdivisions.
Yeah.
There's no stores.
And there's no
you have to
walking.
drive anywhere.
Right.
It's sort of silly.
And you know, that's the other part of it, is that we don't live in these little communities, so we really have to work harder to have that connection. But the other thing is that this is all about human connection, human relationships. But dogs and cats, you know, when you pet a dog, also oxytocin, both parties, oxytocin released. So the affiliation and affection that we have for our pets, for our animals, and the benefits of feeling connected also extend to really anything that's inside of our social world. So if you've ever called your dog by, like, oh, it's my daughter, my little daughter, or, you know, my babies, it's because you are affiliating with them the same way that you would affiliate with your kids or your friends, sometimes more, depending. So, yeah. So animals are also their own little puzzle. So, having pets, having friends, having people you care about, things you care about that interact with you is the core message here.
Even gardening, even have little plants.
Yeah, absolutely. Plants are great.
You have to talk to those plants, it's important.
Yeah.
Talk to them, they grow better. They grow better.
All right. Any other questions? We're about out of time.
I mean, even if it was safe enough for in your communities, you have like little open houses or little, I mean, tea house. You have tea time in your house once a month or something, or someone in the community would. Well, in some areas, just open your garage door. They like garage sales is sort of a good way.
Yeah, and you know, and there's always a million reasons. People say to me frequently, well, there's nothing available. There's no opportunities for me to go socialize. But you are as much part of the social network as everyone else. So, and we can always, it's so easy to think of a reason to not go out, to not invite others over. It's so easy to think of those reasons. And we so rarely think about why we are the one who should be reaching out, who could be reaching out, who's in a position to improve someone else's life. So even if it's just one, even if you just call one person, send one person a little note, even on Facebook, one new person a day, that's help. That changes it, that improves things. So go out, make friends. Buy dogs. Thanks. Yes, sorry.
Well, psychology recognizes people who are introverted, and they seem to be happier that way, am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and introverts, they definitely get stressed out when they have to interact. But the thing about introverts is that they prefer to be alone a lot, but they still have relationships. Their relationships are just of a slightly different nature. My mom, again, is a perfect example. She has coworkers and gets a lot of, and she talks to her family, but she prefers to spend most of her time alone, and that's okay.
Yeah.
She's introverted, but not isolated.
I'm sort of like that a little bit. I don't like going to bars, or I don't like to be around loud, really loud people.
You don't like to go to bars?
No, I don't like all the loudness and stuff. I'd rather be, smaller group, even loud concerts. I like that one night. That's good. This is too much.
Yeah.
I sound like a little quieter, try to be mellow.
Yeah.
So this is the perfect environment for you.
Well, I used to go to Buddhist meditation too. That's sort of fun. I go to Zen centers and Buddhist teachings also. And lectures too. That's really good.
Yeah.
I usually live near Stanford, and I go to all sorts of lectures. And
As you mentioned.
I started getting interested in how the brain works and things.
Cool.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr.
Yay.